Hi everyone, my name's Jasmine,
And I'm Vladimir.
and we're going to be talking about preparing your application for this upcoming psychiatry residency application season. So, a little bit about us first. We are both incoming PGY1s, and we recently went through the Match 2024 cycle. We both coupled matched into the same program, fortunately, and each of us applied to general psychiatry programs as well as the combined adult and child psychiatry programs. And each of us also applied to 127 programs, all of which were the same. So for today's agenda, we're going to be first talking about choosing programs to apply to. We're going to be talking about the ERAS application itself, and that involves geo-signaling, program signaling, personal statements, letters of recommendation, and lastly, we'll close out talking about sub-internships and how to do well on them. So the goals for today is to share what we wish we knew when we went through the match cycle last year, share our own experiences and some tips that hopefully will help all of you guys and really help you strategize how to approach this match cycle.
All right, so we're going to start off with the state and statistics of psychiatry currently. So if we look at the NRMP and the ERAS data, you can notice that the data kind of varies between both websites. The NRMP lists that there are 382 programs. In some programs, this number is different than ERAS because ERAS lists 304 programs. So this might be because some programs aren't participating in the ERAS application platform. But in total, there's 2,261 positions that are offered for psychiatry applicants. This past match cycle, 4,021 applicants applied to psychiatry, and 3,176 went through the NRMP match. And this number might be smaller than the 4,000 number, mostly due to applicants either withdrawing during the match cycle or not having a rank list at the time of matching. So if we look at the total data or the 4,000 number, you see that there's about 1.78 applicants per position for total applicants. But for those that made it all the way to the NRMP match, there was about 1.4 applicants per position. Now, one of the hot topics that are talked about within psychiatry is, is psychiatry getting really popular? But if you look at the trend since 2019 on ERAS, you can see that there's actually been a downtrend in applications to psychiatry. In total for MD, there was a total of 1,779 applicants. For IMG, 1,438, and for DO, 804. So as you can see, where there's a lot of difference in popularity is for IMG applicants, you can see that their kind of numbers of application have been decreasing since 2019, and for DO applicants, it's been steadily increasing since 2019. So if we look at the 2024 match placement rates for NRMP and ERAS, based on ERAS total applications, and this includes those that withdrew and didn't submit a rank list, you can see that the MD match rate was 77%, DO match rate was 64%, and the IMG match rate was 25%. But when we look at the NRMP numbers, those are the applicants that actually went through the match. You can see that the MD match rate for psychiatry was 85%, DO match rate was 74%, and the IMG match rate, unfortunately, was not shown on the NRMP website. So let's talk about what makes a competitive applicant. Usually when people talk about competitive applicants, they kind of see them on this linear line with, one end having a really competitive applicant who might have a high step score. They might be AOA, they might have honored on multiple rotations, have a lot of research and volunteer, and a lot of things on the psychiatry-wise on their CV. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, you might see someone that's less competitive as having a low step score, maybe having multiple red flags and no psychiatry on their CV. But we like to think of psychiatry competitiveness on different types of levels. You can have an applicant that's competitive, either academic, research-wise, community-wise, or a more focused kind of area within psychiatry, like a VA focus. So there's really different types of competitive applicants when approaching the match cycle.
So we mentioned red flags in the previous slide, and you can address these red flags if you have any in your personal statement, impactful experience, or the section where you explain any interruptions in your training. And red flags can vary from step failures, shelf failures, etc. Just know that it's not a death sentence to have red flags or multiple red flags. You just have to be really informed, prepared, and also strategic in how you approach the cycle and apply.
So this kind of leads us into our next point of how many programs you should apply to. So when you're looking at the number that you should apply to, you can kind of look at both ERAS and NRMP. So for ERAS, these were the numbers of as of January 2024. On average, MD applicants applied to 63 programs, DO on average applied to 81, and IMG applicants applied to an average of 65 programs. For NRMP, these numbers are based off the 2023 applicant survey that they put out. For MD, the average was 50. For DO, the average was 68. And they labeled everyone else as other, and the average for that was 106. So when you're wondering how many programs you should apply to, if you're less competitive, you should think about increasing the number of applications that you have, and you should also consider dual applying as well. And it's not a time to be conservative with your money. And we'll be deciding on programs that you should apply to soon. And also when it comes to averages for match applicants, one of the great sites that you can use is the NRMP charting outcomes. And so the charting outcomes is a biannual report that's put out by the NRMP. It was last published in 2022. So the next report will be coming out sometime in July of this year. The charting outcomes is great for specialty specific averages. So it'll give you information on step scores, the number of interviews, and research numbers that matched applicants and unmatched applicants have for specific specialties. And so the only applicants who gave consent are included in this data, and the source is from the NRMP data warehouse. So just a little more information about the charting outcomes. We'll be talking about these outcomes once they're released in July of 2024. So we'll put in a plug for Instagram at Psych Squared, and we'll post updates and breakdowns of these new charting outcome reports before you submit ERAS. And this will help you use this data to really help you gauge what your competitiveness is going into the match cycle.
Okay, next we're going to be talking about finding residency programs to apply to. So there are two main tools that you can use to figure out which programs you want to apply to. The first being the AAMC residency tool. And this tool gives kind of general information about programs, not really a lot of individual statistics about the applicants, versus the second program called Texas STAR. So this has individual data with interviews, statistics, but it is also self-reported. So you have to keep that in mind. And only certain medical schools will get access to this database, unfortunately. But the good thing about this, about Texas STAR, is that you can see the statistics of the applicants and see if someone who got a similar step 2 score interviewed at some program to see if you have a chance for a program. And then you can also see how likely a program will give an applicant an interview if they choose to signal that program. And then lastly, you can see, I think, which is important, the region and state of the applicants. So say you're from South Dakota and you want to go to a California school, you can see if people from South Dakota are likely to interview at that California school by looking at the region of the applicant. Another way that you can figure out which programs to apply to is definitely the program's website. So usually programs will have a program website if you just Google their name, and you can get a lot of good information from their website. And then other things to consider when choosing programs is things like location or city. Do you want a big town or a small town? Variety of clinical sites. Do you want community, private, both, VA, and then other things like proximity to family, hobbies, etc. So when we were applying, our main priority, since we were trying to couples match, were big cities with multiple programs to increase our chances of being in the same place. But we also wanted, diversity of clinical training. So having training sites, public, private, VA, as well as patient populations. Since we were applying to CAP programs, which is child and adolescent psychiatry, we wanted early exposure during the second year of residency. And then we also valued things like research, psychotherapy, work-life balance, and then proximity to our families. So a little more tips about choosing programs for couples like ourselves. Do you want to target big cities that have programs right next to each other, or maybe like an hour within each other? Try to avoid small programs that don't have nearby programs. And if a program is, one of your tops and has no neighboring program, look at the resident class sizes. see if they're small or big, and see if they've taken 2 or more residents from the same medical school in the past, X amount of years. And if you're a DO or IMG applicant, the AAMC Residency Explorer tool is really useful in seeing the resident breakdown of percent of MD, DO, and IMG for each program. So it's really helpful to see if they are IMG friendly or DO friendly. You can also go to the website or their social media pages to look at their past resident classes to see if they've taken, IMG applicants in the past year or 3 years. And then a note for IMGs, some programs, they do have rotation settings that require their program residents to be US citizens. For example, some VA programs, so just keep that in mind. When you're looking at program websites, usually on the frequently asked section, they'll answer the question if they sponsor visas. So that's really important to know when you're choosing which programs to apply to. And this is an example of the AAMC Residency Explorer tool. You can see you can filter by state over here. And then this is really important, as I was talking about before, like the percentage of the type of residents. So MD, DO, IMG, and non-US IMG. And then another snippet from one of the programs, you can see number of filled resident positions by year. And then you can also see application trends to see how many applications they've received in the past few years. And another cool thing is that you can see the percentage of applicants the program interviewed.
And this is the dashboard for Texas Star. So although a lot of it is self-reported and there's not a lot of data for it, the really neat thing about this website is that you can look at data in different ways. So here you can see that you can look at programs, the data for programs from a residency program perspective. So you can see the number of interviews that some of these programs gave out, the average interview rate for in terms of the number of applications they received and the number of people they interviewed, the average interview rate with a signal if you ended up signaling that program, and the average interview rate without a signal. And so this is really neat because you can see it from a program perspective, but you can also change the data to see it from an individual perspective. So you can look at individual applicants and see what medical schools they came from, what were their step 2 scores, what were their research numbers. And so you can really look at the data in a lot of different ways.
And when you look at programs, usually they fall into one of these categories. So academic programs, which are usually connected to large academic centers, usually in larger cities, versus community programs that may be more in rural areas and may have a different type of focus on the patient population. And then there are programs that mix academia and community together. And then also there's some programs that are very VA focused. They can have about 80% of their training at VA settings. And then other programs have a very heavy emphasis on psychotherapy. So these are just kind of the main types of programs that there are definitely more out there. So what programs look for? When you ask program directors or associate program directors what they are specifically looking for, sometimes they are kind of vague and they say they review applications holistically, which definitely they do. But one way to kind of see if you fit the program is to look at their mission, which is usually on their website, kind of on the front page or on the About Us. And you can assess if your application, your personal statement, your values reflect the mission of their program. And then also a lot of prestigious programs, maybe like the top 20 or Ivy Leagues, we believe they're starting to lean towards maybe higher step 2 scores compared to past cycles because step 1 is no longer scored anymore. But even if you do get a below average or low step score, it's still possible to get interview invites here. From talking to different programs and their websites, looking at a lot of websites, some do mention the step 2 filter of 220. So just keep that in mind. And that step filter may be different depending on the program. So it could be less, it could be higher. So now we're going to talk about virtual open houses. So virtual open houses are really a good way to get to know a program even more beyond their website. There's something called the Psychotherapy Open House, which is put on by the Psychotherapy Medical Student Interest Group. And this year it's going to be on August 17th. We went to it last year or last summer, and it was extremely helpful, especially if you're interested in therapy. And it kind of persuaded us to find programs that have a heavier emphasis in therapy. So if you want to follow them for more information, their Instagram is psychotherapy.msig, and they're supposed to put out more information relatively soon. And then there's also the PsychSign open house calendar that you can refer to for individual program open houses. Another big open house program is put out by the AAD PRT regional fairs. These are usually in the peak summer season, usually July and August. These are screenshots of last year's information and sessions, since this year's hasn't been released yet. Just note that it's really good to sign up in advance. Slots will fill up pretty fast. I remember we tried to get into some of the regions and we weren't able to because the slots were already filled up. So just check their website relatively soon to see when you guys can sign up. And this is also a really good way to decide which regions to signal, which we'll talk about later too. So individual programs will also have their own fairs or open houses. And to find out when they happen, you can follow their individual Instagram or Twitter/X pages. Unfortunately, there's no central location for all of these virtual open houses. So it's really on the applicant to follow the different programs and which ones you guys are interested in applying to and going to. So you can create a separate Instagram or Twitter account aside from your personal one, or you can also follow these programs from your personal account. And when you do go to these open houses and program fairs, we really advise you to take detailed notes. And you can use these detailed notes later on in the application cycle to tailor your personal statement, which we'll talk about later, to prepare for their interview if you get one from that program, and also consider in your letter of interest. These program fairs are also really good for getting a vibe and getting a sense of the culture of the program, including residents, faculty, and leadership like program directors, and as well as figuring out which programs to signal. So something that we wish we knew or wish we did last year was use a spreadsheet early on to compare all of these programs when we were ranking our programs, because they all start to blend together after a while.
Let's go into the ERAS application. So these are the updates from AAMC for the ERAS application. So programs can start reviewing your application on September 25th at 9 a.m. Eastern time. And so one of the new introductions is the AAMC fee assistance program. So you might remember this from when you were taking your MCAT or when you were applying to medical schools. It's a fee assistance for those applicants that come from a lower socioeconomic status. And the only way that you can use this fee assistance program is if you were previously enrolled in it prior to going into medical school. And so what this fee assistance program does, it provides a 60% fee discount on up to 50 ERAS applications. And there's also a new fee structure that's being introduced this year. So now you will pay $11 for every application that's number 1 to 30, and then $30 for every application from number 31 and upwards. So now this year you're seeing discounts of up to about 36% compared to last year. And for the Hobbies standalone section is back. This section now allows you to include 300 characters worth of information. And for this one, you can be super specific.
As an example, on my application, I included a link to my website that I already had. And on that website, it had videos of my music, of dancing, and also some pieces of my photography. So this was a good way to show, the reviewers who I was outside of a paper application. So if you have something or something similar in terms of art forms that you can showcase on another platform and can include it in the application, I really recommend doing so. A lot of interviewers brought up my website during our interview, and it was something that I'm really passionate about, and I think they could tell during the interview.
And for me, I included my passion for playing and watching soccer and also doing media production as well. And like Jasmine said, my hobbies were also a very huge topic of conversation. So I think the tip that I would include is that don't worry about having a very unique experience in your hobby section. Really just include things that are really passionate to you, because interviewers can tell right off the bat if this is really something that you love to do to like unwind or you like to do as one of your hobbies. So don't try to include things that are just unique just for the sake of trying to stand out. One of the bits of advice that I usually give applicants, if it's unique, it'll be a topic of conversation because the interview will want to know more about it. And if it's something that everyone does, like watching sports, for example, people will relate to it easily and it'll be a very easy conversation to have. So really there's no one side that's better than the other. If it's either unique or if it's common, it's really who you are that you want to showcase.
Another AAMC update is that letter writers can indicate if their letter is going to be a SLOR, which is a standardized letter of recommendation, and this is manually entered by the letter writer. And then another update is that hometowns decrease from 5 to 3. So you guys can now list up to 3 hometowns.
And something that I'm not too much of a fan of is that the wording has changed for including information about training interruptions. The old ERAS asked if an applicant's medical training was ever interrupted, and it gave you 510 characters to explain that. The new ERAS application, the wording has changed to say, or to ask, have you ever had an unplanned professionalism or academic issue in your medical education or training that has caused an interruption or extension? So I'm not a big fan of this because it kind of lumps all interruptions together with academic issues. So there's a lot of different reasons that you might have had in academic or training interruption. Currently, there's not really a lot of guidance on yet how to approach this from a lot of the people that are heavily involved or analyze a lot of the medical education side of applying. So we'll keep an eye out and just stay tuned. Once we kind of gather a little bit more information about it, we'll give you guys kind of the rundown of what people suggest how you should approach this section.
And then there's also the MSPE that's part of your ERAS application, specifically the noteworthy characteristics. So this section has 3 characteristics, and each characteristic is maximum 2 sentences and 300 characters. And usually they're written in third person. So depending on your school, sometimes schools will have the applicant write their own characteristics. And then sometimes the schools will write them for the applicant. So it just depends. And these characteristics can range from volunteer work, leadership, etc. And one tip that we'd like to give you guys is to try to quantify experiences if you can, to show a more transparent impact to whoever is doing the application. So say, for example, you volunteered at a clinic for 4 years, you can include the total number of hours that you volunteered at the clinic to show how often and how committed you were at that experience. And this is an example from my application last year. So as chair of X clinic, Miss X was responsible for managing clinic operations, where she has supervised 2 committees, developed QI projects, mentored underclassmen in clinical skills, and created policies and proposals, all while providing continual healthcare to an underserved patient population. As director of the admin committee, she was awarded a X fellowship to create and implement an electronic system, which significantly expedited the approval of free medications for uninsured patients from 62 to 15 days. So I included this example to show the quantification of my project. So 62 days to 15 days. I didn't just say expedited the approval of these medications. And I think a lot of people saw these numbers and they brought them up in my interviews. So it's really good to quantify experiences whenever you can. And another part of the ERAS application is the experiences. So you all will get 10 experiences, 3 of which can be marked as meaningful.
So here's kind of an example of my 10 experiences that I put down. So I included this so you guys can see the different range of things that you can include. So I had a community project, I had a APA research presentation that I did, and a student-run free clinic leadership. And those were the 3 that I marked as meaningful experiences. And the rest of them were psychiatry leadership roles, different mentorship roles that I had, non-psychiatry student leadership, and a couple of things from my undergrad experiences. So one of the questions that comes up a lot, is can you include undergrad experiences? And the answer to that is yes. So I included 2 experiences. That one was when I was a camp counselor, and the other one was a youth soccer coach experience that I had. And those were actually really big topics of conversations during my interview. And then I included the work experience that I had before medical school, and also a section for my hobbies, because during our application season, we didn't have this as a standalone section, but for your year, you will have the hobby section back.
So for some tips for writing your experiences, try to use bullets so that the reader can more easily read, your experiences. And like I said, with the noteworthy characteristics, try to quantify experiences as much as possible. You can also list several experiences into one experience if you have more than 10 that you want to talk about. And like Vlad said, you can definitely include college experiences. I did as well for mine. And the character count is going to be adjusted with cycle. So just pay attention to the AMC website or ERAS website for updates on that. Another tip is make sure that your role or title of the experience is something that's eye-catching and very descriptive, because it's going to be the first thing that the reader will see at the very top of each experience. So instead of saying just a volunteer, you can put or describe it as a longitudinal volunteer at student run free clinic, for example. And you can also print out your application to confirm how the experiences are going to look from a reviewer's perspective. And this goes for the entire application. We printed our application at least 5 to 10 times, checking to see if there are any grammar mistakes or if we wanted to change the structure of anything. So it's really helpful at the very end when you're planning to submit. This is an example of one of my experiences from my application. So at the very top, that was my role, grant recipient, fellow for life, parentheses mentor. So you can also define things in the role. Since mentorship is really important to me and something I want to invest in later on as a resident and attending, I wanted to make sure that came across in my application. So a fellow for life meant that I was mentoring future and current fellows for this fellowship project. And then I'll list organization, location, setting, and all of these things, and dates and all the types of things. And then here is where you see the bulk of the information. It's organized as bullets so that the reader can read it more easily. And if you look at all the bullets, you see a lot of numbers. So I really try to quantify as much as possible, which I think gets the point across and gets your impact and your commitment across more than not having any numbers. So if you can quantify, try to as much as possible. And this was also one of my most meaningful experiences. So for each most meaningful, you get a little space at the bottom to explain why this particular experience is very meaningful to you. You can see it's just about 1 to 2 sentences.
So next we're going to be talking about geo preferences. So if you can look from this photo, this hasn't changed from the last cycle. So you can see how the AMC or ERAS divides up the different regions within the US. So for geosignaling data from MD applicants, this past cycle, only 78% of MD applicants marked 3 regions, 7% marked 2 regions only, and 7% marked only 1 region. So from this data, you can see that people didn't use all the regions that they got. And this could be because they were only interested in going to certain regions that were less than 3, or they wanted to appear as if they would go anywhere. One of the big advice that we got when applying, and really from the data from this year, is do not leave any geo signals on the table. Use all 3 of your signals. Programs cannot see what other regions you signaled besides their region. So the only thing they see on their end is if you signal their region, so they'll see a yes or no for that, or they'll see if you marked no preference, which is you used none of your 3 regions. So really, really suggest using all 3 of your geo preference signals. In terms of what we did for our geo signals and some tips that we followed as well. So for the first tip, this is kind of a gamble that we did on our end. We decided not to geosignal Texas because we had very strong ties to Texas. We've lived here our whole lives. We've gone to school and medical school here. And this gamble ended up working out in our favor. We applied to 12 schools here in Texas, and we got 11 out of those 12 programs. In terms of the 3 geo regions that we signaled the Pacific, the Middle Atlantic, and the New England region. And just to kind of give some numbers in terms of what our yield was in terms of the number of programs we applied to and how many of those ended up interviewing us. For the Pacific region, where Jasmine had a family connection to Northern California, I got 11% of interviews from the number of programs we applied to. Jasmine got 18%. For the Middle Atlantic, we had social ties to the area, and we got 11% of interviews from the number of programs we applied to there. And then for New England, we had social ties there, and we've got 16% of interviews from the programs that we applied to that area. And then for outside of the 3 regions, not including Texas because of our strong ties there, we had a yield of about 16% of interviews to the number of programs that we applied to. And so when you geo-preference a region, you get the opportunity to include a little blurb about why you're geo-preferencing that region. And so this is the example that we use whenever we were geo-preferencing a region. We would say, I hope to train in the X region to obtain a comprehensive education and experience in culture. Additionally, I would be supported by my family and social network who live in this region. And so another thing that you can, another area of the ERAS application is setting preferences. This is different from the geo preferences. This is saying where you would prefer to work in terms of a suburban, an urban, or a rural area. So for us, for this specific section, we said we had no preference and we would be excited and grateful to train in any setting in terms of the little blurb that you can include. For the MD data for this specific area of ERAS, 44% of applicants marked no preference and 40% marked that they would either work in a suburban or urban area. So really, it didn't have, I feel like, too much of an effect on where you were kind of saying what preferences you would work in. So now going into signals. So in terms of signaling, there's a new update for you guys this year. The signaling for psychiatry is going from 5 to 10. So this is great. I feel like 10 was a perfect number for psychiatry. And it's a number I wish that we would have had when we applied this past cycle. An important thing to note is that when you use your signals or you signal a program, you cannot update your signals after submitting your ERAS application. So one of the things you want to do is you want to ask your home institution if you need to signal them. And you also need to find out if you're doing any away rotations, if you need to signal that program or if that program is going to already signal or already interview you without the need of a signal. And so I wanted to include some information on the data in terms of signaling. So here you can kind of see the wide distribution of signaling for all the programs in psychiatry. And so you can see on this end, this is really like the top 20 programs, the Ivy League programs, where they're getting upwards of over 1,500 applications. They're getting around 200 to 250 signaling. So you can see a lot of the concentration of signaling is going to some of these top programs. You can kind of inference as well that these top programs can kind of be choosy in who they choose to interview. 1,500 plus applications is way too many applications to go through for a single program. So they can kind of narrow down their focus and really just focus on the applications on applicants who signaled. And so you can see how this concentration is just kind of on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end, you can see some programs are getting just a little bit above 500 applications. They're probably getting less than 50 or less than 100 signals. And so there's just a really wide distribution on the way that signals are going out to programs. So 280 programs were accepting signals this past cycle. And one of the big important parts of the signaling data is that 10% of programs received 25% of all signals. So you can see that a huge majority of signals are just going to a very small concentration of programs, or just 28 programs are receiving almost a fourth of all the signals. So you really need to strategize the use of your signals. So this really showed us that top programs are receiving the most applications, they're receiving the most signals, and they can choose to focus solely on the top applicants who signaled them. So one of the things you really need to start thinking about when you're considering what programs to signal is that you want your signal to equal an interview. So some things that you should consider is, will I be considered by a top 10% program without a signal? Or should I show love to a non-top program and guarantee an interview from them? So these are some of the things that you need to start thinking about now when you're considering which programs to apply to and which programs to signal. So here's a little bit more data in terms of what the conversion rate is in terms of signaling and what are the chances of getting an interview when you signal a program. So in terms of the ERAS data, and this was as of December of this past cycle, on average, when applicants sent a signal, there was a 44% chance that they would get an interview from that signal. On the opposite side, if an applicant didn't signal a program, on average, they would have a 7% chance of getting an interview at that program. And if you add a program signal and a geo signal, those chances actually increase a lot higher. So one of the things I really want to get across is that you need to use all of your signals. If you're not using all 10 of your program signals, you're just leaving money on the table. It doesn't help you to only signal 8 or 9. You really want to use the maximum amount. because you want to increase the chances of getting interviews at those programs. So let's go a little bit into signaling strategy. So when you're thinking about what strategy to use, one of the things that is recommended is that you want to list all the programs that you want in the order that you want them. And then you need to go through that list and you need to assess the probability of getting an interview without signaling those specific programs. So the strategy you need to keep in mind is you need to use a signal to get an interview you wouldn't have gotten an interview at otherwise. So using a signal on a program where you're qualified or maybe overqualified, but your seriousness of wanting to master might not be clear. For example, this could be a scenario where you're from Texas and you really want to go to North Dakota, but nobody's from Texas has ever matched there. You really have no social connection, no professional connection to the program, but you really want to go to that specific institution. You might be a qualified applicant, or you might actually be overqualified, but you have really high step 2 score. You might be AOA. So this program might see your application and think, this applicant is applying broadly. They're not really considering our program. Even if we interview them, we might waste an interview because they wouldn't seriously ever come here. By using a signal, you're actually increasing your chances now of having your application looked at. And so one of the other things to consider is that you're a qualified applicant, but an interview isn't really guaranteed at a top program. So if you're aiming for those top 10% programs, you need to strongly consider signaling them to really be considered for an interview. Because as you can see from the data, a lot of these top 20 programs, Ivy League programs, they can really be a lot more choosy or selective on who they consider in terms of what applications they're looking at holistically. So one of the things that we also advise is don't waste a signal if you're not qualified. Just because you kind of throw a signal at a top 20 program or an Ivy League, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to increase your chances at a signal at an interview. So you don't want to waste a signal if you're not qualified to actually try to get an interview from that program. A lot of this is really going to come down to really what is your personal risk tolerance. Are you willing to signal more top 10 programs to get more interviews, or are you going to want to play it a little bit more safe and just signal target programs or safety programs? So it really just kind of comes down to your personal risk tolerance. And, I used a little bit of the terminology right now, so I wanted to kind of cover that for this next section. So this is the terminology that people use when talking about program competitiveness. And I want to start off right off the bat saying that this is subjective. Everyone's terminology for this will kind of depend on the type of applicant you are. But in general, when you hear the word a safety program, this usually refers to programs where your qualifications are the same or higher than the applicants that they usually interview. This may be due to the program having lower scores. This is a program that really does a lot more of a holistic review. This might be a newer program, or this might be a program that's in a not as desirable geographical location. And then you have your target program. So this is not a top name program, but it's well established. This is a place where your qualifications align, but you may or may not have any regional or social connections to the program. You're in the same state or have a strong tie to the program or location. So these are the different types of scenarios where this might be a target program for you. And then you have your reach program. So these might be the top name programs where your qualifications align with this program, but you may not have any regional or social connection to the program. And so this is to kind of help you kind of gauge the terminology for, what might be a safety, a target, or a reach program for you. And so these are some suggestions that we went through in terms of, how would we approach signaling if we were kind of these three categories of applicants, from a below average applicant, or an applicant that has a lot of red flags, an average, or a competitiveness. So one of the things we suggest is that if your school does provide you access, of going through Texas Star and seeing if you can gauge how to categorize the programs you're applying to and see what their competitiveness is based on their step score. And if you're an applicant that's below average or has a lot of red flags on their application, one of the things that we suggest is applying to about 7 to 8 safety programs and 2 to 3 target. This is for applicants that might have a low step score below a 230, or might have little to no items that are psychiatry on their CV. So one of the things we suggest is really showing love to a lot of those safety programs that you'd be okay matching to. From the data you saw, a lot of these programs are probably getting less than 50, less than 100 signals. So this really increases your chances of getting an interview there. So you want to increase the number of safety to target ratio depending on your number of red flags and competitiveness. So for For a lot of people, this will either increase or decrease that ratio. You just really have to gauge, where your application is at if you're kind of in this area of applicants. For average applicants, we suggest apply or signaling 7 target programs and 3 safety programs. And so for that, the 7 target, you can increase or decrease the target to safety ratio based on your competitiveness. And for the more competitive applicants, we recommend having 8 targets and maybe 0 to 1 safety programs or 0 to 2 reaches. And it's just going to come down to your risk tolerance and really how competitive you feel as an applicant. And so this is the approach that we took when we were signaling. So keep in mind, for our application cycle, we only had 5 signals. So for me, I signaled 3 target programs and 2 reaches. In total, I got a total of 4 interviews from my 5 signals. I got interviews from all 3 of my target programs that I signaled, and only 1 out of the 2 reach programs I signaled, I got an interview at.
And then for me, I signaled 4 target and then 1 reach. And fortunately, I was able to receive 5 interviews from the 5 signals that I used. And then for couples, 4 out of our 5 signals were the same. The 1 signal that was different, unfortunately, I was the only one who got an interview from there. So that was the one that I signaled, but he didn't signal. So if you are couples matching, we recommend that all your signals be the same. And another part of the application is the impactful experience, which is about 750 characters max. For my application, I did not want to disclose a potential impactful experience. So I use the quote, this example: I have been fortunate to not yet encounter a significant challenge or hardship in my life that has risen to the level of derailing my studies or work. So this is just a personal preference. I didn't want to talk about anything that I went through during medical school in an interview. So a tip is only write about something if you are comfortable talking about it in interviews with complete strangers or even in group interviews. You just have to be mindful of that.
And I included an impactful experience on my application. I felt comfortable discussing it. So for mine, I talked about my background coming from a low socioeconomic status background and experiencing family loss during medical school. So these were different hardships that I had that affected my kind of approach to coming into medical school and then during my time during medical school. So what I wrote specifically was, as a Latino American from a low income family, I was raised in an environment with food scarcity, crime, and no access to medical care. As a first-gen college student, I spent my whole life working while going to school to help support my family. Due to COVID, I supported my family when I started medical school. I included a sentence about the family tragedy that I experienced during medical school, talked about the aftermath of managing my mother's care, lawyers, and closing out our family business while still dealing with medical school and taking steps. And then this is the last 2 sentences I felt like were the important part about when you include an impactful experience. You always want to kind of end on a positive note in terms of framing it in a way where, these are the impactful experiences you might have experienced either coming into medical school or during medical school, but you want to convey that these things are things that have been resolved and aren't things that might prevent you from adjusting to residency or being able to leave the city or state where you currently are at to attend residency. And so the last 2 sentences, I made sure to convey that my mother made a full recovery and now lives with my sister. And these were experiences that really helped me become more resilient and helped me in terms of approaching adversity. So I really wanted to convey that when I was writing this impactful experience.
And another part of the application is hometowns. So this year, you guys will get 3 hometowns that you can list, and these can range from, your hometown where you were born and grew up in, or any place that you spent a good amount of time, say college, med school, any type of graduate school, and also places where you feel a strong connection to. So this could be places where your family lives, where your close friends live, etc. So for our application, we listed several hometowns in Texas to show that we had strong ties to Texas since we didn't geo-preference Texas. So now we're going to be talking about the personal statement, which for psychiatry specifically is very important, especially compared to a lot of the other specialties. A lot of program directors and whoever is reviewing your app will definitely read your personal statement in its entirety. So I really recommend starting to draft or brainstorm your personal statement now. Also, don't use artificial intelligence because some people that review your application can put it through a system and they can see if you used AI or not. So it's best to be on the safe side and not use AI. Instead, you should turn to people for feedback or suggestions. Always good to have a psychiatry mentor. It could be a faculty, a resident, it could be the PD at your home institution, to look over to see if it answers the questions, why psychiatry? But on the flip side, you also want to have someone read it who knows you really well and knows your personality. So for mine, I had my mom read my personal statement and I asked her if it sounded like me, if it was representative of who I am as a person and my values. So it's really good to get both sides of those suggestions. And then after a few revisions, try to only ask a few people for continued edits, because if you have so many people giving you different edits, it can be overwhelming, stressful. And just know that it is your personal statement at the end of the day. So you can choose to take any of these suggestions or not. So the structure of the personal statement should really answer these questions: who you are as a person, and you can talk about your childhood, your family, hobbies, your identity as an individual. And then, of course, why psychiatry? So why did you decide on psychiatry? When did you decide? Just the story about that. And another thing is what you have to offer as a potential resident at that program. So any unique experiences that you can bring to the table, any skills. In my personal statement, I talked about a love for teaching and medical education. So that was geared towards a lot of academic programs, which I was really interested in. So I talked about my skills and experiences in teaching, all the way from college to med school. And then lastly, what are your career goals? So I mentioned academia in my personal statement, but you can mention community psychiatry, you can mention potential fellowships that you're interested in or settings. So it really depends on who you are as an applicant. And for the personal statement, usually you should keep it under a page, but when you enter it into ERAS, sometimes a page will fluctuate based on characters. So we recommend having maximum around 3,897 characters. And also in your personal statement, you can address any red flags that you may have. You can also use the impactful experience section of ERAS. But like Vlad said before, try to focus on, positives of potential red flags. Like, what did you learn from, maybe failing a shelf or failing a course? How did you grow, and how will you take that experience and implement it in your future as a future resident? And then a lot of people will ask and contemplate if they should talk about their own mental health conditions. And this topic is very controversial, unfortunately, even though we're in the field of psychiatry. But just know that if you do mention it, you really do have to be very comfortable discussing it with a complete stranger through Zoom or Teams. So just know that they could ask you anything about, that condition or that event if you include it in your application. So for me personally, I had 2 drafts of my personal statement. The first one was about my family member who had untreated, psychiatric conditions. And I didn't end up including it because I felt like I would, cry and break down if someone were to really ask me deep questions about it during interviews. And then also one of my mentors said that the personal statement, while it can, talk about the important people in your life, it should focus on you mostly. So I use that advice, and I focus more on my love for service, love for music, and etc. And then also another tip: try to minimize any general statements that could be found in anyone's personal statement. So with like something general about psychiatry, try not to include it and cross it out.
So this is the example or the approach that I took when writing my personal statement. For my hook or for the intro sentence, I had my experience where I tied my first steps into psychiatry with my experience in coaching youth soccer. So I thought that was kind of a unique sentence to really capture the reader. Then I talked about my passion for helping underserved populations, specifically my work in a student-run free clinic, and kind of tied my own upbringing into this example. So it kind of included my background and then kind of a lot of the skills that I've gained over time. I talked about psychiatry patient encounter I had at the student clinic. So this was kind of led into my why psychiatry and then my passion for developing QI at the student clinic. So some more information about some of the skills that I gained during my time there. And then the last paragraph is specifically tailored to specific programs.
So like Vlad mentioned in the previous slide, he would usually tailor his last paragraph depending on the program. So this is kind of what's called a personalized personal statement. And some programs actually want you to write a personalized personal statement. You have to be really tedious and check their websites. So example, like the last paragraph stating why you want to go to their program specifically. And some examples of programs that required or highly suggested it during our application season is Dartmouth, UWash Seattle, and U Chicago also had a little blurb on their website and asked if we had any research interests and if there is a particular faculty at U Chicago that we would like to work with. So it was asking not only to write a personal statement, but also look at the faculty and their research. So just know that some programs want you to do research before you write their personal statement for that program. And you can do this for as many or as little programs as you want to increase your chance of getting an interview. It just depends on how much time and bandwidth you have. Another way that you can personalize a personal statement is by state. So like family, friends, mentors in a specific region or state, as well as the program. And for us, since we were applying to the combined child and adolescent and adults psychiatry / fellowship program, we mentioned child if the program had a child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship or a CAP track. Just know that few programs do not support fast tracking. So for these programs, we chose to keep it general and didn't mention child. But to each his own, you don't have to disclose that, or you can disclose that for these types of programs. And this is an example of a personalized personal statement of the last paragraph of my personal statement that mentioned my mentor and family ties. So the psychiatry program provides diverse and individualized opportunities that allow me to become a well-rounded physician. And then bolded, after talking to my APA mentor, a current PGY4 at program. And then the next bolded section with support from family members in this city / state. So this, you can see that I mentioned my mentor as well as family members to show that I would really like to go to that program. So suggest a timeline for, writing your statements. Try to think about what you're going to write about, brainstorm right now until the end of June, and try to have a rough draft completed by July, early August, so you can send it to your letter writers, ask multiple people for feedback, and incorporate that feedback in a timely manner. And hopefully by the 18th, which is the week before ERAS is due, you'll have all of your personal statements finalized. And this will include your general one and any personalized personal statements that you may have, because it takes a while to upload each statement to your ERAS portal and making sure it's under a page. So just make sure you give yourself enough time to do that.
So we'll talk a little bit about the research section for ERAS. So for this year, there's no significant changes to the 2025 ERAS portal. So no limitations are going to be put for the number of research items you can include. They are deciding changes for the 2026 cycle this May. And so we'll keep an eye out to see if there's an update to see what the 2026 cycle decision will be. But for this year, you can include submitted abstracts and manuscripts. You can include accepted posters, even if you haven't presented yet. As long as it's been accepted before you submit ERAS, you can include that on your application. And you can also include things, make sure to only include things that you're comfortable talking about. Your interviewer may ask you about a project that you did during your first year of medical school. So make sure you're only including research topics or projects that you worked on that you're really comfortable talking about. And really try to avoid padding your resume. You don't want to include a lot of the same projects that you presented at multiple different conferences. If it's multiple presentations of the same project, I would just stick to one conference or one presentation and the most prestigious conference you've presented that work at, and really try to avoid padding your resume when applying. And so next we'll talk about tracks. So for tracks, these are specific tracks that are associated with one program. So one program may may have different types of tracks. So it doesn't cost more money to apply to the multiple tracks for one specific program. So when you see a program, so let's say X residency program will be on ERAS, and then below it, you can check off the different tracks that you want to apply to. So some examples are categorical tracks, which are the regular 4-year adult track. There might be a child track, which is the combined adult and child residency program, which is 5 years. There might be a research track, which has embedded electives dedicated to research, or there might be a community track where some of your rotations will be more community or rural focused. So you can select all the different tracks within a residency program, or you may select one or a couple, but it really doesn't cost more money to apply to the different tracks within a program. And then some other options as well is that you can also dual apply or triple apply within psychiatry. So there are residency programs that combine internal medicine and psychiatry. There's some programs that combine family medicine and psychiatry, neurology and psychiatry. And then for the triple board programs, there's a pediatrics, adult psychiatry, pediatric psychiatry, triple board programs.
Now, next we're going to be talking about letters of recommendation. So this is letters of recommendation for general psychiatry only. So most programs will require 2 to 3 letters, with at least one being from a psychiatrist. There are some programs, very few, that require 4, so just make sure you look at the program websites to know their specific requirements before submitting your application. So a general good rule of thumb is to get at least 1 psychiatry. If you can get 2, that's great, because some programs will ask for 2. They usually won't make it mandatory, but they prefer 2. And a lot of programs actually want a non-psychiatry letter, so medicine, family medicine, pediatrics. Some program websites will say that they prefer internal medicine, but you can use peds or FM if needed. So try to get an internal medicine letter. And this doesn't have to be strictly IM. It could be from geriatrician. It could be from nephrology. It could just be from any IM specialty as well. It doesn't have to be purely IM. And then if you are applying to any research tracks, try to get at least 1 from a research mentor, which can be a psychiatrist or can be your medicine. It can overlap with other letter writers. And then lastly, the SLOR, which is the standardized letter of recommendation. Try to get 1 SLOR from a psychiatrist. There are very few programs that require the SLOR or highly suggest it, because it's relatively new, and they're testing it out to standardize the application even more. So just try to get 1 psychiatrist to fill out a SLOR for you. And when you're asking for letters of recommendation, these are some of the tips that we wanted to share. If you've worked with this attending in the past few years, you can ask them through email. Just make sure that you have a picture in your signature at the bottom so that they can put a face to a name. And if you are going to work with them during your 4th year elective or sub-internship, a good way to approach asking for letters is asking for feedback in the middle of that rotation, especially if ERAS is going to be that next month. And when you do ask for feedback in the middle of rotation, you can mention, the possibility of getting a letter, since this is, a sub-internship, and they usually expect people to ask them for letters during a sub-I. And at the end of the rotation, you can ask for feedback compared to the middle of the rotation. And depending on what they say, you can ask for a letter. And when you do ask for a letter, you always want to ask or specify a strong letter of recommendation. And when they do say yes, hopefully, you could provide your letter writers with an updated CV and your personal statement draft. So this is why it's important to start thinking about your personal statement now and having a draft sooner than later, so that they can maybe talk about your reasonings for psychiatry in their letters and your application, so it's consistent. And after they agree, you can also provide points that you'd like them to discuss in the letter. So some way that I did this, I would email them a list of things that I wanted them to mention in the letter, or highlight in yellow certain aspects of my CV that they could talk about. And usually they're pretty agreeable to this if you just, ask nicely and in a timely manner. So timeline for letters, try to send your letter writers reminder emails often. There are, unfortunately, instances where students are, they're ghosted last minute and they're scrambling to find someone to take the place of their letter writer. So just know it's better to ask for more just in case this happens to you. Hopefully it doesn't. If you ask for more, you don't have to use all of them. So that's always a plus to just have it backup. Give letter writers about a 3-week deadline before ERAS is due, because it does take time to upload the letter from their standpoint, to process the letter from the ERAS standpoint. Especially for IMG, sometimes it takes a lot to like validate the letter. So just try to do it as early as possible. And you can also assign certain letters to programs. So for example, I got a letter from a child and adolescent psychiatrist that I used for programs where I was applying to the combined child and adult psychiatry tracks. So you can do that with research, you can do it with community, really anything.
So we'll talk a little bit about sub-internships. So some of the tips that we kind of advise for you guys that are going to be doing sub-internships or sometimes called acting internships is that you want to arrive early, you want to be prepared every day. If you can get access to the patient list beforehand, that's always great to kind of read up and see what patients are on the list, kind of see what the treatment plans are for them. When you get there on your first day, try to read the room and see what your expectations are. Do they just want you to kind of observe? Do they want you to also interview? Do they also want you to write some of the notes? So try to gauge what your expected responsibilities are. And after you kind of get that baseline, start asking for more responsibilities. For example, when we were on a consultant liaison sub-internship, we were kind of, we would just round together. One of the expectations that we had was just really listening to the interview and then writing the notes. So we started asking if we could interview the patients with them present. We also started asking if we could hold the pager, and whenever we would get a consult, if we could be the one to call the consult team with the resident next to us, kind of observing us and making sure we were asking all the questions that they would usually ask when asking about a consult. And so these are different ways that you can start asking for more responsibility, because you want to start thinking, what ways can I start acting more as a resident as compared to when I was a third-year medical student, where you might write the note, you might just kind of observe. So you want to start asking for more responsibility. And then take the initiative to try to teach some of the underclassmen that might be on the service with you. Don't try to pimp them and see what their knowledge base is. Try to teach them about concepts that might be complicated or might come up on their shelves. So this is a great way to really show the team that you love to mentor, if that's one of the things that you're really interested in. You really want to be engaged at all times. If you have a lot of downtime, try to see if there's things that you can help residents and faculty with, such as getting collateral or more information on a patient that might not be able to kind of give their history. So, calling the family to kind of get a little bit of a better idea of who the patient was, what their story is. Trying to get updates from different teams that might be treating your patient, and also updating the family, which can be kind of a day-to-day task that the residents or faculty might get overwhelmed with. So really try to be as helpful as you can. And so some things to really consider is that even though you might be doing an away rotation for a sub-I or an acting internship, it doesn't always, unfortunately, guarantee an interview. There's a list of kind of ghost stories, is what they call them, on the Reddit Psychiatry Excel spreadsheet, where students kind of went to the program, did an away rotation, felt like they did great, but they unfortunately didn't get an interview at the end of their away rotation. So just know that if you are accepted to do an away rotation, that is a possibility.
So takeaways from the meeting: try to work on your personal statement as soon as possible, better sooner than later. And since you guys get 10 signals this year, signaling is really, really important. So try to research programs heavily, going to their virtual fairs, going to their open houses, trying to get a feel if you vibe with the program and their culture. And to help with that, create a spreadsheet to keep your notes and thoughts and ideas organized, since a lot of times later on when you're ranking programs, things will start to collide and blend in together. And really, reflect on what you want in a program, whether you value research, work-life balance, if you're moving with a family, etc. And another thing is try to use your school email or a .edu email for your ERAS account, because sometimes if you use Gmails, if you're sending an email to an institution, it can be categorized as junk, or it can be sent to their quarantine and you may miss an opportunity to interview. So just try to use a .edu email from the beginning. and try not to switch your emails in the middle of the application cycle. I did that in the beginning and I didn't see a interview invite. Fortunately, I was able to interview with the program, but just try to keep the same email to avoid that situation. And for those of you who are not applying this cycle but will be in the near future, um, becoming a strong applicant, there's a lot of ways to do that. Just focus, or we recommend focusing on longitudinal experiences in psychiatry or in, topics or fields where you're really passionate about. Try to get involved in national organizations. There's, APA for general psychiatry. There's ACAP for child and adolescent. There's AACP for community psychiatry. There's ACLP for consultant liaisons. So just search up, what are your interests in within psychiatry and try to get involved outside of your school to stand out. And then lastly, try to get a high or at least an average step 2 score if you can, because that is becoming, programs are prioritizing that a lot now that step 1 is pass fail. And like I said before, national organizations, you can also join their mentorship program. So PsychSign, they had a mentorship program when I was about to apply last year that I joined, and I got a mentor from that program, and I was able to talk with her about my application and talk about the programs that she's familiar with, and she was able to introduce me to some of the leadership at those programs. So it can go a long ways. And other mentorship programs include ACAP, AACP, which is community psychiatry, and I'm sure there are tons of others if you just look at their website.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please contact us. Here's our Instagram plug again. It's probably the fastest way to reach us. We have a QR code here on the side. It's going to be at psych_squared. Also, our YouTube channel, we're going to have, upload videos when a lot of the different information comes out this summer for the charting outcomes. We'll be uploading all this on all our different social media platforms. If you have any questions as well, you can email us at psychsquared2@gmail.com. And like I said, we'll be trying to keep you guys up to date and keep you informed before you apply. And keep an eye out in September of this year. We're going to be doing an in-depth workshop, which is kind of a part 2 to this workshop. We're going to be talking about interviews, so how to schedule, prepare for interviews, social second looks, also talking about letters of interest versus intent, couples match letters of interest, and how to rank more effectively or correctly. So this will all happen shortly before ERAS is due. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll post a sign-up form on our Instagram.
If you guys have any suggestions or any topics you want us to cover, feel free to reach out to us or comment on this video as well.
And here is a long list of sources that we use to create this workshop. Just really interested in a lot of the data that goes along with applying to ERAS. We've really poured through all the different PDFs and really looked at all the data in the past years to put this workshop together and really help you guys be the most informed applicants that you can be. So here's just a list of a lot of the sources that we used.